Late one evening, a well-dressed man walked into a busy restaurant. He was a CEO of a large company, and he carried himself like the whole world should move for him. People noticed how confidently he walked, how he spoke loudly, and how he expected attention wherever he went. A young black waitress came to his table with a polite smile. She greeted him warmly and tried her best to make him comfortable. Even though the restaurant was already full and she had many tables to serve out at first, everything seemed normal. She handed him the menu, offered water, and patiently waited for his order. But when she brought his drink, she realized she had made a small mistake. Instead of the wine he had asked for, she had brought a different bottle. It was a small slip, something any person could make during a long shift. She quickly apologized and offered to replace it, but the CEO didn't accept it with kindness. His voice grew sharp, and then, without lowering his tone, he called her stupid. The word hung heavy in the air. The sound of his insult reached other tables. People stopped talking for a moment. Some looked at the waitress with sympathy. Others shook their heads at the man's arrogance. The waitress froze, her hands tightening around the tray she was holding. She wanted to disappear, but instead she took a breath, forced a small smile, and said softly, "I'll fix it right away." Her eyes showed hurt, but she kept her dignity. Across the room, two men in suits noticed everything. They weren't just ordinary guests, they were investors who had been following the CEO's work closely. They had already planned to meet him the next morning to finalize a deal worth hundreds of millions. But in that quiet corner of the restaurant, they whispered to each other. One of them leaned in and said, "If this is how he treats people when no one is watching, what does he do in his office?" The other nodded, his expression turning cold. The CEO, meanwhile, enjoyed his meal without a clue. He didn't see the stares, the shaken heads, or the whisper that had already begun to change the course of his future. What seemed like a small insult to him was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, the restaurant still buzzed with quiet talk about what had happened. The young waitress came in for her shift, still carrying the sting of the night before. She had replayed the moment in her mind over and over, the sharp word, the way people stared, and how small it had made her feel. But she also remembered the kind nods from some of the guests, the way a woman had slipped her an encouraging smile, and how she had walked away with her head held high, even when her heart was heavy. She didn't know that her strength had left a mark on more people than she realized. Across the city, in a tall glass office, the CEO was preparing for what he thought was the biggest victory of his career. He had been chasing a $200 million contract with two major investors for months, and today was the day they were supposed to sign. He woke up confident, dressed in his finest suit, and practiced his charming smile in the mirror. To him, the world revolved around power and money. He believed no one would care about how he treated a waitress in a restaurant. After all, who was she compared to him? But the two investors were already carrying the memory of that night. They had not been able to shake off the scene they had witnessed. The way the waitress had stayed calm after being insulted told them more about character than any business report ever could. They spoke quietly over breakfast. One of them said, "Money can grow, but respect is something that can't be bought. Do we want to tie ourselves to someone who lacks it?" The other agreed, remembering the look in the waitress's eyes when she forced herself to smile. While the CEO drove to the meeting, proud and careless, the investors had already started to think differently about him. They didn't talk about numbers anymore. They talked about trust, values, and the kind of leadership that truly lasts. The CEO had no idea that the contract he believed was certain was already slipping through his fingers. In that small restaurant, a single word had changed everything. What the CEO thought was just another night of showing his power had turned into a test of his true self, and without knowing it, he had already failed. The morning sun poured into the tall glass building where the meeting was set to take place. The CEO walked through the lobby with his head high, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. To him, today was already a victory. Months of negotiations had led to this moment, and in his mind, the deal was just a signature away. He didn't notice the quiet looks exchanged between the two investors waiting upstairs. He didn't know they were already carrying doubts, heavier than the weight of the contract papers in their hands. Inside the boardroom, the air felt different. The CEO expected smiles and handshakes, but instead he was greeted with cool nods. He sat down, spreading his papers confidently, making small jokes to lighten the mood. One of the investors asked him a simple question, not about the deal, but about his night. "How was your dinner yesterday?" The CEO leaned back in his chair, smirked, and waved his hand dismissively. He spoke casually about the restaurant, then added, "The staff wasn't very sharp. I had to correct them." He chuckled at his own words, as if it was something impressive. The room grew still. The investors glanced at each other, the same thought passing between them without a word. It wasn't just the mistake he had made in the restaurant, it was the way he told the story now, as if belittling others was a badge of honor. The very same moment that had made them question him was now being confirmed by his own lips. For the first time, the CEO noticed something was off. Their smiles didn't return. Their pens stayed untouched on the table. He quickly shifted to talking about numbers, profits, and growth. He tried to overwhelm them with charts and bold promises. But the investors' focus wasn't on the numbers anymore. They had seen enough of his character to know that no figure on a page could cover the cracks in his values. Minutes stretched into silence. The CEO's confidence began to waver. He could sense something slipping, though he couldn't put his finger on it. He thought this meeting was about business, but for the investors, it had turned into something much bigger. They weren't just deciding on money, they were deciding on the kind of man they wanted to stand beside. The CEO left pauses, waiting for agreement, but none came. The deal, he thought was sealed, was already unraveling thread by thread. The boardroom had grown uncomfortably quiet. Papers sat untouched, pens rested idle, and the air felt heavier with each passing second. The CEO, once so sure of himself, shifted in his chair. His confident smile was beginning to crack. He leaned forward, talking faster now, throwing out promises of expansion, higher returns, and strategies that sounded flawless on paper. But the investors weren't looking at the numbers anymore, they were looking at him. Finally, one of them slid the thick folder of contracts back across the table. The sound of the leather cover brushing against the polished wood seemed louder than his own heartbeat. The CEO blinked, confused. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The older investor leaned back, his eyes firm. "We've decided not to move forward." The CEO's face went pale. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "Not move forward?" he repeated, his voice catching in his throat. He tried to laugh it off. "Gentlemen, this is a $200 million deal. We've discussed everything for months. You won't find a better offer out there." The younger investor leaned in, his voice calm but sharp. "Numbers aren't the problem. Respect is. Leadership isn't about money, it's about character. Last night, we saw a side of you that told us more than any report could. If you can treat someone with such little dignity in public, how do you treat the people who work under you?" The words hit him harder than any financial loss ever could. The CEO stammered, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to explain, to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, but the investors didn't budge. They had already made their decision. One of them closed his notebook and stood. "You see, wealth can grow, contracts can change, but a man's true self always shows. And we saw yours." The CEO sat frozen, unable to find the right words. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. In his arrogance, he had thought one careless insult meant nothing. But now, in the silence of the boardroom, he realized it had cost him everything he had worked for. The investors left with quiet steps, leaving behind not just unsigned papers, but a lesson that would follow him long after the echo of the closing door faded. The news spread faster than the CEO ever imagined. Within days, whispers about the lost $200 million deal reached other boardrooms and business circles. His reputation, once built on confidence and power, now carried a stain no amount of money could erase. People began to look at him differently, not as a leader, but as a man whose arrogance had undone him. Back at the small restaurant, life went on. The young waitress still tied her apron every morning, still smiled at customers, still carried trays heavier than her arms wanted to bear. She didn't know about the meeting or the contract. She didn't know that her quiet strength had shifted the course of a giant deal. For her, it was just another long shift. But something had changed. People came back to the restaurant and remembered her grace. They whispered to each other, "That girl. She handled herself with more dignity than the man in the suit." One evening, as she cleared a table, a familiar face returned. One of the investors who had witnessed it all walked in. He didn't come with papers or contracts, only with a quiet smile. He asked to sit at her section. When she brought him water, he thanked her warmly and said, "I wanted to tell you something. That night, the way you carried yourself, it mattered. More than you know." She looked surprised, unsure what he meant, but his words lit something inside her. He didn't explain the lost contract or the millions at stake, but he left her with one thought: sometimes dignity speaks louder than money. As for the CEO, the sting of his downfall stayed with him. He learned too late that leadership is not measured in deals signed, but in the way you treat people who can do nothing for you. His empire began to shrink, while the waitress, without even trying, became a quiet symbol of grace in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed the night. In the end, the story wasn't about a man who lost millions. It was about a young woman who, with calm and courage, showed the world that respect is priceless. And while the CEO's name faded in gossip, the memory of her dignity continued to inspire far beyond the walls of that restaurant.